It was a cold November morning in 1980. A security guard making his rounds through the empty corridors heard something that made his blood run cold. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoing from the grand ballroom on the third floor. But that was impossible. The castle had been sealed for 3 years. No one had the keys except him. When he climbed the marble staircase, flashlight trembling in his hand, he found the ballroom exactly as it had been left. Dust covering every surface, chandeliers draped in white sheets, and in the center of the room, a single chair pulled away from the table, as if someone had just stood up and walked away. The guard quit that same day. He never returned. The castle, a 72-room medieval fortress rising from the forests of upstate New York, had claimed another believer in its mystery. This is the story of Overlook Castle and the man who built it, then vanished without a trace. The boy who collected secrets. To understand the castle, we must first understand the boy who dreamed of building it. His name was Theodore Ashford Winthrop III, though everyone who knew him simply called him Theo. He was born on September 14, 1921, in a modest brownstone in Brooklyn, New York. The world around him was changing rapidly. The Roaring Twenties were just beginning. Jazz filled the streets, and fortunes were being made overnight in the stock market. But young Theo wasn't born into that world. Not yet. His father, Theodore Jr., worked as a clerk in a shipping office near the docks. His mother, Eleanor, took in sewing to help make ends meet. They were respectable, hardworking people who believed in education, discipline, and the American dream, but they were far from wealthy. Theo was a strange child, quiet, observant, always watching. While other boys played stickball in the streets, he sat in the public library reading books about medieval Europe, ancient Egypt, and lost civilizations. He was fascinated by secrets, by the things people buried and forgot, by the stories that time erased. His teachers noticed something unusual about him. He had a photographic memory. If he read something once, he remembered it forever. Numbers, dates, names, details. They all stayed locked in his mind like treasures in a vault. By age 12, he could recite entire passages from books he'd read years before. By 14, he was solving complex mathematical equations that stumped his high school teachers. His parents didn't know what to make of him. Eleanor would watch her son sitting by the window for hours, staring out at the city, and wonder what thoughts filled his mind. "What are you thinking about, Theo?" she'd ask. He'd turn to her with those intense gray eyes and say simply, "Everything. The fortune that changed everything." The Great Depression hit in 1929, and like millions of Americans, the Winthrop family suffered. Theodore Jr. lost his job. The family had to move to a smaller apartment. There were nights when dinner was nothing more than bread and thin soup. But young Theo, only 8 years old, watched his parents struggle with a calm determination. He made a promise to himself during those dark years. One day he would have enough money that his family would never worry again. What happened next sounds like a fairy tale, but it's absolutely true. In 1936, when Theo was 15 years old, his grandmother on his mother's side passed away. She had been a reclusive woman who lived in a tiny apartment in Queens, rarely speaking to the family. No one expected her to have anything to leave behind. But when the lawyer read her will, the Winthrop family sat in stunned silence. Theo's grandmother had inherited a piece of land in Montana from her own father decades earlier. For years, she'd received small royalty checks from a mining company that leased the property. She'd never spent the money. She'd simply deposited the checks into a savings account and forgotten about them. By the time she died, that account held over $180,000. In 1936, that was a staggering fortune. Adjusted for today, it would be worth nearly $4 million. And she left every penny to her grandson, Theodore Ashford Winthrop III. The inheritance came with one condition, written in her own shaky handwriting at the bottom of the will. For the boy who reads, build something beautiful, Theo was 15 years old, and suddenly he was rich, the education of a genius. With his grandmother's money carefully invested by his parents, Theo finished high school at the top of his class. He was accepted to Columbia University in 1939, where he studied architecture, engineering, and business. But Theo wasn't interested in simply getting a degree. He wanted to understand how empires were built. He read voraciously: economics, history, philosophy, psychology. He attended lectures on subjects that had nothing to do with his major. He spoke with professors late into the night, asking questions that made them uncomfortable. How do you build something that lasts? What makes people remember? How do you create beauty in a world that forgets? His roommates thought he was odd. While they went to parties and dated girls, Theo spent his weekends exploring abandoned buildings in New York City, crumbling mansions, forgotten warehouses, churches left to rot. He'd sketch them in notebooks, studying their bones, understanding why they'd been built and why they'd been abandoned. Then came December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. America entered World War II, and like millions of young men, Theo enlisted. He joined the Army Corps of Engineers, expecting to build bridges and airfields. Instead, his unique mind caught the attention of military intelligence. For 4 years, Theo Winthrop worked on classified projects that remain partially sealed even today. What we know is this: he was involved in code breaking, cryptography, and strategic planning. He worked alongside some of the brightest mathematical minds in the country. And when the war ended in 1945, he emerged with two things: a deeper understanding of systems and patterns, and a network of connections to some of the wealthiest, most powerful men in America. The rise of an empire. Theo returned to New York in 1946 at age 25. Most veterans were looking for steady jobs, trying to rebuild normal lives. But Theo had other plans. Using his grandmother's money as seed capital, he started buying real estate. Not just any real estate. He had a system. He'd identified patterns in urban development, ways to predict which neighborhoods would grow and which would decline. He bought buildings that others thought were worthless, warehouses in areas that were about to boom, apartment complexes in neighborhoods on the verge of gentrification. And he was almost always right. Within 2 years, his initial investment had tripled. By 1950, he was a millionaire. By 1955, he was worth over $10 million. He expanded beyond real estate into manufacturing, buying struggling companies and turning them profitable with ruthless efficiency. He invested in television, seeing its potential before most. He bought radio stations, newspapers, and eventually a small film production company. But unlike other wealthy men of his era, Theo stayed almost completely out of the public eye. He gave no interviews. He attended no charity galas. He was never photographed at nightclubs or restaurants. Most New Yorkers had never heard his name. Those who had worked with him described a man who was brilliant, intense, and completely unreadable. He could calculate complex financial projections in his head. He could remember every detail of every contract. And he could negotiate with a cold, calm precision that left even experienced businessmen unsettled. One business partner later recalled, "Talking to Theo Winthrop was like playing chess against someone who could see 20 moves ahead. You always felt like you were losing, even when you thought you were winning." The woman behind the mystery. In 1956, at a private art exhibition in Manhattan, Theo met a woman named Isabelle Rousseau. She was 28 years old, a French immigrant who had fled Paris after the war. She worked as a translator and occasionally modeled for painters who appreciated her classical beauty. She had dark hair, pale skin, and eyes the color of storm clouds. When Theo saw her standing in front of a Renaissance painting, something shifted in him. For the first time in his life, the man who calculated everything felt something he couldn't quantify. He approached her and said simply, "That painting is from 1487. The artist died 2 years after completing it. No one remembers his name, but his work survived. That's immortality." Isabel turned to him and smiled. Or perhaps it's tragedy, to be forgotten while your creation remains. They talked for 3 hours. When the exhibition closed, Theo asked if he could see her again. "Only if you tell me something true," she said. "Something you've never told anyone else." Theo was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm going to build something that will last 1,000 years, and I have no idea why." They married 6 months later in a small Mendal private ceremony. No press, no society page announcement, just a judge, 2 witnesses, and a promise. Isabel was unlike anyone Theo had ever known. She challenged him. She asked him uncomfortable questions. She made him laugh, something his business associates would have found impossible to believe. She loved art, music, and literature. She filled their apartment with paintings, sculptures, and books in 3 languages. She taught Theo to appreciate beauty not as an investment, but as something necessary for the soul. And she planted a seed in his mind that would grow into an obsession. "You have all this wealth," she said one evening as they looked out over the New York skyline. "But what will you leave behind? Money disappears. Companies fail. What will still be standing when we're gone?" Theo didn't answer that night. But the question haunted him, the search for the perfect place. In 1958, Theo began looking for land. Not in the city, where everything was crowded and compromised. He wanted space, privacy, somewhere remote enough to build exactly what he imagined, but close enough to civilization that it wouldn't be completely forgotten. For 2 years, he searched. He traveled through upstate New York, Vermont, Pennsylvania. He looked at hundreds of properties, mountains, valleys, lake shores. Nothing felt right. Then in the summer of 1960, his real estate agent told him about a property that had just come on the market. 500 acres of dense forest in the Catskill Mountains, about 120 miles north of New York City. The land included a small mountain peak, several streams, and absolute privacy. It had belonged to an old lumber family that had gone bankrupt. The price was surprisingly low because the land was considered too remote, too difficult to develop. Theo drove up to see it on a gray morning in October. The dirt road wound through forests so thick the sunlight barely penetrated. When he reached the summit, he stood at the edge of a cliff and looked out over the valley below. Mountains rolled away in every direction. A river snaked through the distance like a silver thread. The air smelled of pine and earth and rain. And for the first time since he was a boy, Theo Winthrop felt something close to peace. "This is it," he said aloud, though no one was there to hear him. He bought all 500 acres within a week. The vision of a medieval dream. That winter, Theo locked himself in his study with architectural books, sketches, and plans. Isabel would bring him coffee and find him surrounded by drawings of medieval castles. Neuschwanstein in Bavaria, Warwick Castle in England, the Chateau of the Loire Valley in France. He wasn't trying to copy any single structure. He was studying them, understanding their principles, their strengths, their beauty. "I want to build a castle," he told Isabel one night. "A real castle, not some Victorian mansion with fake turrets. Something that looks like it's been standing for 500 years. Something that will still be standing 500 years from now." Isabel didn't laugh. She'd learned that when Theo said something, he meant it. "Why a castle?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment. Because castles were built to last. They were built to protect something precious, and they were built to be remembered. By spring of 1961, Theo had hired a team. Not a single architect, but a collection of specialists. A structural engineer who had worked on bridges. A stonemason from Italy who understood medieval building techniques. A historian from Oxford who specialized in 13th century architecture. And an architect named Robert Brennan, who had designed museums and understood how to blend old and new. Theo's instructions were specific. "Build me a castle that looks like it was built in 1300. Use modern engineering to make it survive earthquakes and hurricanes. But make it authentic, real stone, real timber, real craftsmanship. I want someone to walk inside and believe they've traveled back in time. The construction begins. In June 1961, the first trucks rumbled up the newly built road to the mountaintop. The project began not with stone, but with infrastructure. Electrical lines were run underground. A well was drilled 400 feet deep. Septic systems were installed. A helicopter pad was cleared for emergencies. Theo had learned from his research. Medieval castles had failed not because of their walls, but because of disease, fire, and lack of water. His castle would have every modern convenience, hidden behind medieval facades. The foundation was poured in August, a massive concrete base anchored directly into the mountain bedrock. On top of that, workers began laying stone. Not decorative stone facades, but massive granite blocks, each weighing several tons. They were quarried from the mountain itself, cut and shaped by stonemasons using techniques that hadn't changed in 700 years. By winter, the outer walls had begun to rise. They were 12 feet thick at the base, solid stone all the way through. Workers marveled at the construction. This wasn't a house, it was a fortress. As the walls climbed higher, the shape of the castle began to emerge. It would have 4 main towers, each rising 80 feet into the air. A massive keep in the center, 5 stories tall. A great hall with vaulted ceilings. A courtyard with a fountain. And surrounding it all, curtain walls with battlements where medieval soldiers would have stood guard. The design was a blend of English and French castle architecture, but with subtle innovations. Hidden steel reinforcements, modern ventilation, fireproofing systems. Theo visited the site every week, often staying for days. He'd climb the scaffolding, talk with the workers, inspect every stone. He carried a leather notebook where he sketched modifications and additions. His perfectionism drove the crew to the edge of madness, but they respected him. He never asked them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. They once saw him, dressed in expensive clothes, climb down into a muddy trench to help a worker who dropped a tool. The interior of dreams. As the exterior walls neared completion in 1963, work began on the interior. This was where Theo's vision became truly extraordinary. The Great Hall was the centerpiece. 60 feet long, 40 feet wide, with a 30-foot vaulted ceiling supported by massive oak beams. The beams themselves were a marvel. Theo had purchased them from a demolition company that was tearing down a 400-year-old barn in England. They were shipped across the Atlantic and installed by craftsmen who understood medieval joinery. No nails, no screws. Just mortise and tenon joints that would hold for centuries. The walls were covered in wood paneling carved with intricate designs. Hunting scenes, mythological creatures, family crests that Theo had invented. 3 enormous fireplaces, each large enough to stand inside, were built from stone quarried from a 12th century monastery in France that was being demolished. The windows were perhaps the most extraordinary feature. Theo had commissioned stained glass from a studio in Germany that still used medieval techniques. Each window told a story. Some showed historical scenes, knights, battles, coronations. Others were abstract patterns of color and light. When the sun shone through them, the interior of the castle glowed like a church. The floors throughout the castle were a mix of materials. In the Great Hall, massive stone tiles from an Italian palazzo. In the upper floors, wide oak planks salvaged from old ships. In the towers, spiral staircases of worn stone that looked like they'd been climbed by generations of feet, though they were newly carved. Every room had a purpose. A library with floor-to-ceiling shelves waiting to be filled. A music room with perfect acoustics. A dining hall with a table that could seat 40 people. Bedrooms in each tower, each with its own fireplace and windows overlooking different views of the mountains. And below everything, carved into the mountain itself, a series of basement rooms, wine cellars, storage, and one room that Theo called his archive. Though no one understood what that meant, the obsession deepens. As construction continued through 1964 and 1965, Those close to Theo began to notice changes. He was spending more and more time at the castle site. He'd built a small cabin near the construction area where he'd stay for weeks at a time. Isabel would visit, but less frequently. The long drive, the isolation, the constant noise of construction wore on her. "Come home," she'd say. "The castle will still be here tomorrow." But Theo couldn't pull himself away. He'd found something on that mountain. Not just a construction project, but a purpose. He'd spent his whole life building wealth, making money, winning in business, but none of it had meant anything. The castle was different. It was real. It was permanent. It was his monument to something he couldn't quite name. His business associates noticed too. He was missing meetings, letting opportunities pass. His assistant later recalled finding him in his office at 3 a.m., drawing castle floor plans instead of reviewing contracts. He'd made enough money that he didn't need to work anymore, the assistant said. But it was more than that. It was like the castle had become more real to him than his actual life. By 1966, his companies were largely running themselves. He'd hired managers, delegated authority. He still made major decisions, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. All he wanted was to see his castle completed. Workers on the site began to tell strange stories. They'd arrive in the morning to find Theo already there, standing in the great hall, looking up at the vaulted ceiling as dawn light streamed through the stained glass. He'd be completely still, like a statue. One worker swore he'd seen Theo talking to himself, walking through empty rooms, describing what would go in each space, though no one else was there. It was like he could see the finished castle in his mind, the worker said, like he was already living in it, even though it was still half-built. The completion. In the fall of 1967, 6 years after construction began, Overlook Castle was finished. It stood on the mountaintop like something from another century. 4 towers reaching into the sky, stone walls weathered to look ancient, windows glowing with colored light. It was magnificent, and it was completely mad. The final cost had exceeded $8 million, equivalent to over $70 million today. But Theo didn't care about the money. He'd created what he set out to create, a castle that looked like it had stood for 500 years, a fortress that would stand for 500 more. The interior was now fully furnished. Theo had spent 2 years collecting pieces. Medieval tapestries from European auctions, furniture from castles being sold off by bankrupt nobility, suits of armor, weapons, books, paintings. Every room was filled with authentic artifacts from the 12th through 16th centuries. Walking through Overlook Castle was like stepping into a time machine. In November 1967, Theo and Isabel moved in. They brought almost nothing from their New York apartment. The castle was its own world, and they would live by its rules. They had no servants at first, just the 2 of them in 72 rooms. The isolation was absolute. The nearest town was 25 miles away. The road up the mountain was private, gated. They could go weeks without seeing another human being. For a while, it seemed like paradise. Theo would spend his days walking through his castle, sitting in the library, looking out from the towers. Isabel painted in the music room. They'd have dinner in the great hall at a table meant for 40, just the 2 of them at one end. They'd light fires in the massive fireplaces and read by candlelight. On clear nights, they'd climb to the highest tower and watch the stars, so bright without city lights, spread across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. It should have been perfect, but something was wrong. The darkness arrives. By the spring of 1968, the dream had started to crack. Isabel began spending more time in New York. She'd make excuses, business to handle, friends to see, art exhibitions. But the truth was simpler. The castle had become a prison. The isolation, the silence, the way every room echoed with emptiness. She felt like she was living in a museum. "I can't breathe here," she told Theo during one argument. "It's beautiful, but it's not alive. It's a monument to the past, and were the only living things trapped inside it. Theo didn't understand. This was what he'd built. This was what would last. How could she not see its perfection? But Isabel saw something else. She saw a man who'd become obsessed, who'd spent 6 years building a castle and now didn't know what to do with his life, who wandered the halls like a ghost in his own fortress. By summer, Isabel was spending more weeks in New York than at the castle. Theo would call her, asking when she'd return. She'd give vague answers. Soon. Next week. After this thing or that thing. In September, she came to the castle one last time. She found Theo in the library, surrounded by books he wasn't reading. "I can't do this anymore," she said quietly. "I can't live in your dream. I need a life that's real." Theo looked at her with those gray eyes, and for the first time she saw something that frightened her. He looked lost. "This is real," he said. "This is more real than anything else." Isabel shook her head. "No, Theo. This is stone and wood. We're real, but you've forgotten that." She left the next morning. The divorce papers arrived 2 months later. Theo signed them without argument. And then he was alone. The hermit in the castle. For the next 9 years, from 1968 to 1977, Theodore Ashford Winthrop III lived alone in Overlook Castle. He hired a caretaker who would bring supplies once a month. Food, books, anything Theo needed. But otherwise, he had no contact with the outside world. His business managers still sent reports. His accountants still filed taxes. His companies still made money. But Theo had effectively disappeared. Those who did see him during this period described a man who had changed. He'd grown thin. His hair had gone prematurely gray. He dressed in dark, simple clothes that made him look like a monk. He'd let his beard grow long. But his eyes were still intense, still calculating, still seeing patterns that others missed. The caretaker, a local man named Marcus Webb, later told reporters what he'd witnessed. Theo had turned the castle into something between a monastery and a fortress. He'd established rigid routines. He'd wake at dawn, spend 2 hours in the library, walk the battlements, eat a simple lunch, spend afternoons in what he called his archive, the locked room in the basement. Dinner alone in the great hall. Evening reading. Bed by 10 every day. The same pattern. Marcus would arrive with supplies and find Theo had left a list of what was needed for the next month. They'd barely speak. Theo would ask a few questions about the outside world. What was the news? Any significant events? Marcus would answer, and Theo would nod thoughtfully, then retreat back into his castle. It was like he'd removed himself from time, Marcus said, like he was living in his own century, separate from ours. But Theo wasn't idle. He was working on something. Marcus would sometimes hear sounds from the archive room. Typing, papers being shuffled, the scratch of pen on paper. When he asked what Theo was working on, Theo would simply say, "Organizing my thoughts." No one understood what that meant. Strange rumors began to circulate in the nearby towns. People who hiked in the mountains claimed to have seen lights in the castle towers late at night. Some said they'd heard music, Gregorian chants echoing across the valley. Others swore they'd seen a figure in medieval clothing walking the battlements at midnight. Most people dismissed these as ghost stories, but a few who knew about Theodore Winthrop wondered if the billionaire had finally lost his mind. The final project. In January 1977, Theo contacted a lawyer in New York. He wanted to make arrangements. "What kind of arrangements?" the lawyer asked. "For after I'm gone," Theo said calmly. Over the next few months, Theo meticulously planned his legacy. He established trusts. He divided his wealth, some to charity, some to establish scholarships, a significant portion to maintain the castle. He wrote a will that was both detailed and mysterious. The castle and its contents were to be preserved exactly as they were. Nothing added, nothing removed. A foundation would be established to care for it. But there was one strange provision. The castle would remain sealed for 20 years after his death. No one would be allowed inside. Not his family, not historians, not the government. 20 years of absolute isolation. Only then could it be opened. When the lawyer asked why, Theo said simply, "Because some things need time to settle." In August 1977, Theo made his final trip to New York City. He met with his lawyer, signed documents, visited his bank. He had dinner alone at a restaurant he'd once loved. Then he returned to the castle. He told Marcus Webb that he wouldn't need supplies for a while. He had everything he needed. Marcus thought nothing of it. Theo sometimes went months without needing anything. But as September turned to October, then November, Marcus began to worry. He drove up to the castle in early December. The gates were locked. He climbed over the wall, something he'd never done before. The castle was silent, completely dark. He knocked on the massive wooden doors. No answer. He walked around the perimeter, looking in windows. The interior was dark, still, empty. Marcus drove to the police. The disappearance. When authorities finally forced their way into Overlook Castle on December 8, 1977, they found something that defied explanation. The castle was immaculate. Everything in perfect order. Fires laid but not lit. Food in the kitchens, still fresh. Books open on tables as if someone had just been reading them. But Theodore Ashford Winthrop III was gone. His bedroom showed no signs of disturbance. His clothes were still in the closets. His personal items were all accounted for, but he had vanished. The investigation was immediate and thorough. Police searched every room, every tower, every basement chamber. They brought in dogs. They searched the surrounding forest for miles. They dragged the streams. They checked hospitals, airports, train stations. They interviewed everyone who'd ever known him. Nothing. No body, no evidence of foul play, no sign of where he'd gone or how he'd left. His car was still in the garage. His bank accounts were untouched. His passport was in his desk drawer. It was as if he'd simply stopped existing. The case became a sensation. Newspapers ran wild with theories. Some said he'd faked his death and was living under a new identity in Europe. Others suggested suicide, though no body was ever found. A few claimed he'd been kidnapped, though no ransom was ever demanded. The most sensational theories proposed that he'd had a complete mental break and was wandering the mountains, living like a wild hermit. Search parties combed the Catskills for months. They found nothing. Theodore Ashford Winthrop III had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. The sealed archive. During the investigation, police had tried to access the archive room in the basement, but the door was unlike anything they'd encountered. It was made of solid steel, set into the mountain bedrock, with a locking mechanism that seemed more appropriate for a bank vault than a castle. They brought in locksmiths. The lock was custom-made, resistant to drilling or picking. They considered using explosives, but Theo's lawyer intervened. He produced a document. In his will, Theo had explicitly forbidden anyone from entering the archive for 20 years. If it was opened early, all funding for the castle's maintenance would be revoked, and the property would be sold. The lawyer had the authority to enforce this. The police had no choice. The archive remained sealed, and so did its secrets. For 3 years, the investigation continued. It eventually became a cold case. Theodore Ashford Winthrop III was declared legally dead in 1980, 7 years after his disappearance. But many refused to believe he was gone. Some claimed to have seen him, a man matching his description in Paris, in Tokyo, in a monastery in Tibet. None of these sightings were ever confirmed. Isabel, his ex-wife, was interviewed multiple times. She seemed genuinely shocked by his disappearance. Theo was many things, she said. Brilliant, obsessive, difficult, but he wasn't irrational. If he disappeared, it was because he planned it. Every detail, whatever happened to him, he chose it. When asked what she thought had happened, she stared out the window for a long time before answering. "I think he finally found what he was looking for." I just don't think it was in this world. The castle stands alone. After Theo's disappearance and legal death, Overlook Castle remained exactly as his will specified. Sealed, maintained, waiting. The foundation he'd established paid for a small security staff. They maintained the grounds, kept the structure secure, but never entered the main building. The castle stood on its mountaintop like a monument to madness. Local legends grew. Teenagers would hike up the mountain on dares, trying to get glimpses through the windows. They'd report seeing strange things, shadows moving inside, lights flickering. Some swore they saw a tall figure standing in the highest tower window, watching. The rational explanation was obvious. Tricks of light, imagination, fear. But the stories persisted. Some claimed the castle was cursed, that Theo had dabbled in occult practices, that he'd discovered something in his research that had driven him mad. Others said he'd been murdered by business rivals, his body hidden somewhere in the vast forest. A few believed he'd never left, that he was still there somehow, living in the walls, haunting the halls he'd built. The waiting world. For 20 years, the world forgot about Overlook Castle. Theo's companies were sold or dissolved. His wealth was distributed. The newer generation had never heard of him. But among certain circles, historians, architects, and true crime enthusiasts, the mystery remained fascinating. What was in the archive? Where had he gone? What had driven a brilliant billionaire to build a medieval castle and then vanish? Some researchers tried to piece together clues from Theo's life. His childhood fascination with secrets, his wartime work in cryptography, his obsessive personality, his belief that he could build something that would last forever. One historian proposed a theory. Theo hadn't disappeared. He'd transformed. He'd spent his entire adult life trying to escape time, to build something eternal. Perhaps he'd finally found a way to do it. The theory was dismissed as nonsense, but it captured something true about Theodore Winthrop. He'd been a man at war with mortality, a man who believed, somehow, that perfection could defeat death. The opening. In December 1997, exactly 20 years after his disappearance, the terms of Theo's will were fulfilled. The castle could be opened. The steel door to the archive could be unsealed. Media from around the country gathered at the base of the mountain. The sheriff's department was there. Representatives from the State Historical Society. Theo's surviving family members. And standing in the snow, now in her 60s, was Isabelle Rousseau, his ex-wife. The convoy of vehicles made the long drive up the mountain. The castle looked exactly as it had 2 decades before. Preserved, waiting. A locksmith spent 3 hours working on the archive door. When it finally opened with a heavy, metallic groan, everyone held their breath. Inside was a room about 20 feet square. The walls were lined with filing cabinets and bookshelves. In the center was a desk with a leather chair. On the desk sat 3 items: a letter, a thick leather-bound journal, and a small wooden box. The sheriff carefully opened the letter. It was addressed to whoever found it, written in Theo's precise handwriting. The letter was 2 pages long. In it, Theo explained everything. The confession. The letter began with an apology. To Isabelle, to his family, to anyone who'd worried about him. Then it told a story. From childhood, Theo had been haunted by the passage of time, by the certainty of death, by the knowledge that everything eventually would be forgotten. He'd built his wealth as a way to fight that inevitability. But money wasn't permanent. Companies failed. Investments dissolved. He'd built the castle as a more solid attempt. Stone and mortar lasted longer than paper. But he'd realized, as he lived alone in those walls, that even castles crumbled. Nothing physical was truly eternal. So he'd turned to the only thing that might actually last: ideas. For 9 years in his archive, Theo had been working on what he called his map. It was a collection of everything he'd learned. Patterns in history, economics, human behavior, architecture, art, philosophy. He'd synthesized it all into a unified theory of how civilizations rose and fell. how to predict change, how to understand the deep currents that moved beneath surface events. It was, he wrote, his attempt to encode his consciousness into something that could outlive his body. The journal on the desk contained this work. 600 pages of dense text, diagrams, and calculations. Historians and scholars would spend years trying to understand it. Some would call it the work of genius. Others would say it was the product of an isolated mind descending into madness. But that wasn't the mystery. The mystery was what happened to Theo. In the letter's final paragraph, he wrote, "I have spent my life trying to defeat time. I have failed. We all fail, but I have discovered something else. There is a kind of immortality available to those willing to pay its price, to become an idea, to vanish from the physical world so completely that what remains is only the question. Where did he go? Why did he leave? What did he know? These questions will outlive any stone I could have built, and so I have chosen to become them. By the time you read this, I will be gone, truly gone. You will never find me. You will never know how I left or where I went, and that unknowing will last far longer than any castle. I have built my monument. It is made of mystery. Goodbye." The letter was signed and dated November 30th, 1977, 8 days before Marcus Webb found the castle empty. The wooden box. After the letter was read, the sheriff carefully opened the small wooden box on the desk. Inside was a single item, a key. It was old, iron, ornate, medieval-looking, but there was no indication of what it unlocked. The box had no note, no explanation, just the key. Investigators searched the castle again, looking for a lock that might match it. They found nothing. Every door was accounted for, every chest, every cabinet. The key didn't fit anything in the castle. Some theorized it was symbolic, a metaphor for the mystery he'd left behind. Others believed it was a final puzzle, a clue to where he'd gone. But after months of investigation, analysis, and searching, no answer was found. The key was cataloged as evidence and eventually placed in a display case, where it remains today, still unexplained. The journal revealed. Scholars were given access to Theo's journal in 1998. What they found was extraordinary. The work was divided into 7 sections, each focusing on a different aspect of human civilization. The first section analyzed patterns in historical rise and fall of empires. Using mathematical models, Theo had identified cycles that repeated across different cultures and time periods. He'd predicted economic collapses, social movements, and technological shifts. Some of his predictions, written in the early 1970s, had already come true by 1997. The fall of the Soviet Union, the rise of digital communication, the shift in global economic power toward Asia. How he'd known these things decades early was unexplainable. The second section dealt with architecture and permanence. It contained detailed analysis of why certain structures survived millennia while others crumbled in decades. But it went deeper, discussing how buildings shaped human consciousness, how physical spaces influenced thought patterns and social organization. The third section was perhaps the strangest. It discussed consciousness itself. Theo had developed a theory that human awareness was not confined to the body, but existed as a pattern, a kind of information that could theoretically persist beyond physical death. He'd drawn connections between quantum physics, medieval mysticism, and cutting-edge neuroscience. Most scientists who read it dismissed this section as pseudoscience, but a few found his arguments disturbingly compelling. The remaining sections covered economics, art, philosophy, and what he called the architecture of memory. Each was dense, complex, filled with equations and references to obscure texts. A team of researchers from Columbia University spent 5 years analyzing the journal. Their conclusion: Theodore Winthrop had been either one of the most brilliant minds of the 20th century or a highly educated man who descended into elaborate delusion. They couldn't agree which. The search continues. Despite the letter's claim that he would never be found, investigators didn't give up. The case was reopened with new technology. Cadaver dogs searched the castle grounds again. Ground-penetrating radar scanned the basement and surrounding areas. Nothing. His financial records were examined in microscopic detail. Every transaction from 1976 to 1977 was analyzed. There were no unusual withdrawals, no purchases of plane tickets, no trail of any kind. The most thorough investigation focused on the month before his disappearance. Marcus Webb had delivered supplies on November 1st. Theo had been there, normal, requesting his usual items. No one had seen him after that. The police traced every person who might have visited the mountain, every delivery driver, every hiker who'd been in the area. No one had seen Theo leave. No vehicles had gone up or down the private road. The security cameras, basic 1970s technology, showed nothing unusual. One detective became obsessed with the case. His name was Raymond Torres, and he spent 3 years after the 1997 opening investigating every theory. He interviewed hundreds of people. He explored every cave and abandoned building within 100 miles. He even had the castle's walls examined to ensure there were no hidden passages or rooms. There were none. In 2000, Torres published a book about his investigation called The Vanishing Billionaire. In it, he presented his conclusion. Theodore Winthrop had planned his disappearance with the precision of a military operation. He'd likely left the castle sometime in November, traveling on foot through the forest to avoid detection. He'd had months to prepare. Cash could have been hidden beforehand, a new identity arranged, transport waiting miles from the castle. Torres believed Theo was alive somewhere, living under an assumed name, having successfully erased his past. But even Torres admitted his theory had holes. How had a 56-year-old man, not particularly athletic, managed to hike through mountainous terrain in winter without being seen? Where had he gotten false identification documents? And most importantly, why? Why go to such extraordinary lengths to disappear? The alternative theories. Over the years, dozens of theories emerged to explain Theodore Winthrop's disappearance. The suicide theory suggested he'd taken his own life somewhere in the vast forest. His body never found because he'd chosen the location carefully. Perhaps he'd fallen into a ravine or cave. Perhaps he'd been consumed by animals. But this theory struggled to explain the lack of evidence. Theo was methodical. If he'd planned to die, wouldn't there be some indication? The murder theory proposed business rivals or enemies had killed him. But Theo had no known enemies. His business dealings, while aggressive, were legal. He'd made people wealthy, not vengeful, and the security of the castle made a murder scenario nearly impossible. The witness protection theory suggested government involvement. Perhaps Theo's wartime work in intelligence had continued. Perhaps he'd witnessed something that required his complete disappearance. But no evidence of government contact was ever found, and freedom of information requests turned up nothing. The most exotic theory came from a religious studies professor who'd studied Theo's journal. She proposed that Theo had been influenced by medieval mysticism, that his castle was never meant to be a home, but a kind of spiritual machine. She pointed to the specific architectural features, the precise alignment of the towers with celestial events, the symbolic imagery in the stained glass, the layout of rooms according to sacred geometry. She suggested Theo believed he could achieve some kind of transcendence, that his disappearance wasn't physical, but metaphysical. Most dismissed this as academic fantasy, but it captured something that haunted everyone who studied the case. There was an otherworldly quality to the whole story. A man who'd built a castle from another time, who'd isolated himself for 9 years, who'd left behind a cryptic journal about consciousness and immortality, who'd vanished without a trace. It felt less like a crime and more like a fairy tale, a dark one where the ending remained forever unknown. The castle today. In 1999, after all investigations had concluded, Overlook Castle was open to the public. It operates now as a museum, managed by the foundation Theo established. Visitors can tour the Great Hall, the library, the towers. They can see the medieval artifacts Theo collected. They can walk the battlements and gaze out at the same mountain views he saw. The archive room is preserved exactly as it was found. The desk, the chair, the empty filing cabinets, the letter and journal are displayed in a climate-controlled case. Even the mysterious key is there behind glass, still unexplained. The castle attracts about 50,000 visitors each year. History enthusiasts, architecture students, true crime fans. They come to see the beautiful and to touch the mysterious. Tour guides tell Theo's story with practiced smoothness. The brilliant boy from Brooklyn, the self-made billionaire, the obsessive builder, the man who vanished. But something strange happens to people who visit Overlook Castle. Many report feeling unsettled, not frightened exactly, but aware of something. The rooms are beautiful, but they echo with absence. The hallways are grand, but they feel like they're waiting for someone who never arrives. Some visitors claim to experience more specific phenomena: cold spots in certain rooms, the sense of being watched, the smell of old paper and ink in the library when no books are open, shadows that seem wrong somehow, that don't quite match the angles of light. The Foundation has never officially acknowledged these reports. They're classified as subjective experiences and attributed to the power of suggestion. But the stories persist. One security guard, working the night shift in 2015, reported seeing a figure standing at the window of the highest tower. When he climbed the stairs to investigate, the room was empty. The window was locked from the inside. He quit the next day. Another visitor, a photographer documenting the castle in 2018, reviewed his images later and found something odd. In one photo of the Great Hall, there appeared to be a shadow in the shape of a man sitting at the far end of the table. But the hall had been empty when he'd taken the picture. He'd been alone. The image was analyzed. No evidence of tampering. No explanation. The anniversary. In December 2017, on the 40th anniversary of Theo's disappearance, the castle held a special event. Scholars presented papers on his life and work. Isabelle Rousseau, now 89 years old, made a rare public appearance. She spoke for 20 minutes, her voice still strong, her mind still sharp. She talked about the man she'd loved and lost, not to death, but to obsession. She described how brilliant he'd been, how intense, how driven by something she'd never fully understood. At the end of her talk, someone asked the question everyone wanted answered. "Do you think he's still alive?" Isabel smiled sadly. "No," she said. "Theo died long before he disappeared. The man I married died somewhere between the first stone laid and the last. What vanished in 1977 was just a ghost, finally accepting it had no place in the world of the living." Then she said something that made the audience fall silent. "But I'll tell you what I believe. I believe Theo got what he wanted. Not immortality, that's impossible, but something close. We're all here, 40 years later, still talking about him, still wondering, still searching. His name will be remembered long after mine is forgotten, long after everyone in this room is dust, because he built something that lasts. Not the castle, the mystery. And mystery, I think, might be the closest thing to eternal that humans can create." She died 6 months later, in June 2018. In her will, she left a letter to be opened by the Castle Foundation. The letter was brief. "I know where Theo is. I've known since 1997, but I'll never tell. Some secrets are more valuable than truth. Let him keep his mystery. He earned it." Was she telling the truth? Had she really known? Or was it a final act of love? Adding one more layer to the enigma. No one will ever know. The legacy. Today, Theodore Ashford Winthrop III is remembered as many things. A business genius who built a fortune from nothing. An architectural visionary who created one of America's most unique buildings. an eccentric recluse who lost himself in his own creation, and an unsolved mystery that has fascinated people for decades. His journal has been published in academic editions. Scholars still debate its merits. His business strategies are taught in MBA programs. His castle is studied by architecture students. But more than anything, he's remembered for the questions he left behind. Where did he go? How did he leave? What did he know? Was he mad or enlightened? Did he find what he was searching for? These questions have inspired books, documentaries, podcasts. Amateur detectives still visit the Catskills, searching for clues. Psychics claim to have contacted his spirit. Conspiracy theorists weave elaborate tales involving secret societies and hidden knowledge. Every few years, someone claims to have seen him. An old man in Peru who matches his description. A recluse in Scotland who has his mannerisms. A patient in a Swiss psychiatric hospital who speaks of castles. None of these sightings are ever verified, but they keep the story alive. They keep people wondering, and perhaps that was always the point. Theo understood something fundamental about human nature. We're not drawn to answers, we're drawn to mysteries. A completed story is forgotten. An unsolved mystery is discussed forever. The final room. There's one thing most visitors to Overlook Castle don't know. During the 1997 investigation, structural engineers did find something unusual. Deep beneath the archive room, carved into the solid bedrock of the mountain, there's a chamber. It's small, about 6 feet by 8 feet. It can only be accessed through a narrow shaft that drops down from the archive floor. The shaft is covered by the large carpet that was found in the archive. The existence of this chamber has never been publicly disclosed. Only a few people know about it. The entrance to the shaft was sealed in 1998. Officials decided that whatever was down there, if anything, should remain undisturbed. Some said it was out of respect for Theo's wishes. Others whispered it was because of what the first investigator reported seeing. He'd been lowered down the shaft with a flashlight and camera. He'd been down there for less than 2 minutes before demanding to be pulled up. He was pale, shaking. When asked what he'd seen, he said only, "Nothing, there's nothing down there." But his hands were trembling so badly he could barely hold his coffee, and in his camera there was a single photograph. It showed the chamber, stone walls, a low ceiling, and in the center, carved into the floor, words in Latin, Mors ultima linea rerum est. Death is the final boundary of things. The chamber was empty. No body, no artifacts, no explanation. Just those words, carved by hand into solid rock. Who carved them? When? Theo? Someone else? The stone showed no signs of modern tools. The carving looked old, weathered, but that was impossible. The chamber had been cut during the castle's construction, wasn't it? Geologists were brought in quietly. They examined the chamber without entering it, using cameras and sensors. Their report was inconclusive. The chamber could have been natural, a small cave that happened to be beneath the archive, or it could have been carved. The stone's age was indeterminate. The Latin inscription could be hundreds of years old or just decades. In 1999, the Foundation's board voted unanimously to permanently seal the chamber. Concrete was poured into the shaft. The carpet was replaced. The archive room looks exactly as it did when first opened. And only a handful of people know what lies beneath. The truth we'll never know. So what happened to Theodore Ashford Winthrop III? The honest answer is, no one knows. He could have walked away, starting a new life under a new name. He could have taken his own life in a location that ensured he'd never be found. He could have had an accident in the wilderness. His body lost to time and nature. He could have been murdered, though by whom and why remains unexplainable. Or, as some believe, he could have achieved something else entirely. Something we don't have words for. A transformation, a transcendence, a final escape from the prison of time and identity. What we do know is this: Theodore Winthrop spent his entire life trying to build something that would last. And he succeeded, not through stone or gold, not through business or wealth, but through the power of an unanswered question. Every year, thousands of people climb that mountain road. They walk through the castle he built. They stand where he stood. They wonder what he wondered. And in that wondering, he lives on. Not as a man, but as an idea, an eternal mystery, a ghost that never needs to appear because it haunts us through absence. Standing in the Great Hall today, looking up at the vaulted ceiling with its ancient beams and stained glass windows, you can almost feel it. Not his presence, his absence. The shape of a man who should be there but isn't. Who built this place for reasons we can only guess. Who filled it with meaning we can't quite grasp. Who walked away from everything, leaving only questions behind. The wind still moves through the battlements. The mountains still roll away in all directions. The castle still stands, solid and beautiful and somehow sad. Waiting, perhaps, for someone who will never return. Or perhaps waiting for nothing at all. Because that's what castles do. They stand. They endure. They outlast the people who built them and the dreams that inspired them. And in their standing, they become something more than stone. They become stories. Stories we tell ourselves about permanence and loss, about ambition and madness, about the impossible dream of defeating time. The boy from Brooklyn who dreamed of castles, the billionaire who vanished into thin air, the mystery that will never be solved. This is what Theodore Ashford Winthrop III left behind. Not answers, not closure, but something more valuable in its own way. A story that will be told as long as the castle stands. And perhaps, if he's watching from wherever he is, that's exactly what he wanted. To become not a man, but a legend. To exist not in life, but in the space between knowing and unknowing. To achieve immortality not by living forever, but by never allowing anyone to confirm he died. In the end, perhaps that was his greatest creation. Not the castle of stone and glass that rises from the mountain, but the castle of mystery and speculation that exists in our minds. A fortress built from unanswered questions. Towers constructed from possibilities that can never be proven or disproven. And in that castle, Theodore Ashford Winthrop III still lives. Not as he was, but as he wanted to be. Eternal, unknowable, impossible to forget. The castle remains. The mystery endures. And somewhere in the silence between then and now, between known and unknown, between life and whatever comes after, Theodore Winthrop smiles. Because he won. He built something that will last. Not despite its incompleteness, but because of it. The greatest works of art are never finished. They're abandoned. And the greatest mysteries are never solved. They're simply passed down. From one generation to the next, each adding their own interpretations, their own theories, their own dreams. Until the line between history and legend becomes so blurred that truth no longer matters. Only the story remains. Only the castle stands. Only the question echoes through time. Where did he go? And that question, that eternal wondering, is Theodore Ashford Winthrop III's true monument. His masterpiece. His castle of clouds and shadows that can never crumble because it was never made of anything solid to begin with. It was made of mystery. And mystery, unlike stone, unlike steel, unlike even the mountains themselves, can last forever.